When I discovered both our spouses were cheating together, my best friend's husband and I planned the perfect revenge. Neither of them saw the prenup coming. I found out about my husband's affair with my best friend in the most mundane way possible, through a grocery store receipt. Not some dramatic discovery of secret texts or lipstick on a collar, but a crumpled piece of paper I found in Daniel's jacket pocket while doing laundry that showed he'd bought 2 bottles of expensive wine, fresh oysters, and strawberries at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday when he'd told me he was in back-to-back meetings all day. The timestamp on the receipt was 3:47 p.m., and I knew with absolute certainty that my husband hadn't been in any meeting because I'd called his office at 3:30 that day to ask his assistant about his schedule for the week, and she'd mentioned he'd left early for a personal appointment. The wine he'd purchased was a specific Burgundy that I'd never seen in our house, the kind that costs $120 a bottle, and that Daniel only bought for very special occasions. My mind immediately went to places I didn't want it to go. But I'm a patent attorney and I'm trained to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when that evidence is leading me toward a truth I desperately don't want to face. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what any good lawyer would do. I started gathering evidence. I checked our credit card statements going back 6 months and found a pattern of charges I'd never noticed before because Daniel handled most of our finances and I'd trusted him completely. Hotel rooms in the city when he'd told me he was working late at the office. Dinner charges at romantic restaurants on nights when he'd said he was grabbing something quick between meetings. Jewelry purchases that I'd never received. And then I found something that made my blood run completely cold. Charges at a boutique hotel in Vermont on the same weekend that my best friend Stephanie had told me she was going to a yoga retreat. The same exact weekend, the same exact dates, at a hotel that definitely wasn't a yoga retreat center. Stephanie had been my best friend since college, 17 years of friendship that I'd thought was unbreakable. She was married to Marcus, who Daniel and I had introduced her to at our wedding 8 years ago. The 4 of us had become inseparable. Couples vacations, weekly dinners, holidays together, godparents to each other's children. My daughter Emma called Stephanie Aunt Steph, and Stephanie's son called me Aunt Jen. We'd built our lives around this friendship, bought houses in the same neighborhood so our kids could grow up together, talked about retiring to the same beach town someday. And now I was looking at evidence that strongly suggested my husband and my best friend had been betraying both me and Marcus in the most fundamental way possible. I needed to be absolutely certain before I did anything, so I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds cold and calculated, but I'm not the kind of person who acts on suspicion alone. And I needed documentation that would hold up in divorce court if it came to that. The investigator's name was Patricia Chen, a former police detective who specialized in infidelity cases, and she was discreet, thorough, and devastatingly efficient. Within 2 weeks, she had photographs, video footage, and a complete timeline of the affair. Daniel and Stephanie had been meeting at a furnished apartment that Daniel had rented under his business name, twice a week for the past 8 months. They'd been careful, never going to the same restaurants or hotels too frequently, always paying cash when possible, maintaining separate phone records. But they'd gotten sloppy in small ways, and Patricia had caught every single one of those mistakes on camera. The day Patricia delivered her final report, I sat in my car in the parking lot of her office and looked through the photographs with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. There was my husband kissing my best friend in a way he hadn't kissed me in years. There they were holding hands walking into that apartment building, looking around to make sure no one was watching. There they were at a romantic dinner, leaning across the table toward each other with the kind of intimacy that takes time to build, the kind that speaks to a relationship that's gone far beyond physical attraction into genuine emotional connection. And there, in what I think was the worst photograph of all, was Daniel with his hand on Stephanie's stomach in a gesture that was so tender and protective that I actually felt my heart crack inside my chest. The report included text messages Patricia had recovered through methods I didn't ask about, and in those messages they talked about leaving us, about being together openly, about how much they hated lying but how they just needed to wait for the right time to tell Marcus and me. I drove home in a fog and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm into the house and confront Daniel immediately, to throw the photographs in his face and scream at him about what he'd done to our marriage, to our family, to our daughter who adored him and had no idea her father was planning to blow up her entire life. But the lawyer part of my brain, the part that had won cases by being strategic and methodical, told me to slow down, to think, to plan. If I confronted him now in this emotional state, he'd lawyer up immediately, and we'd be in an ugly divorce with him trying to hide assets and minimize his financial responsibility. And Stephanie would spin some story to Marcus about how it wasn't what it looked like, how they'd made a mistake but it was over now. And Marcus, being Marcus, would probably believe her because he'd always been the more trusting, more forgiving one of their partnership. I sat there considering my options. And that's when I noticed Marcus's car pulling into his driveway across the street. He got out looking exhausted, carrying his work bag and a bag of takeout, and I watched him walk into his house where his wife was presumably waiting for him, probably fresh from one of her afternoon meetings, that I now realized had been afternoon rendezvous with my husband. And I made a decision that would either be the smartest or the stupidest thing I'd ever done. I was going to tell Marcus everything. And together we were going to figure out how to handle this in a way that protected us and our children and made damn sure that Daniel and Stephanie paid the full price for what they'd done. I waited until the next day, until I'd calmed down enough to be rational, until I'd rehearsed what I was going to say and how I was going to present the evidence. I texted Marcus asking if he could come over while Daniel was at work, telling him I needed to discuss something important about the neighborhood association but not specifying what. Marcus showed up at my door 20 minutes later looking confused but friendly, and the moment I saw his face, his kind, trusting face that had no idea his whole world was about to implode, I almost couldn't go through with it. But I invited him in, sat him down at my kitchen table and said, "Marcus, I need to show you something, and I need you to stay calm because we're going to need clear heads to deal with this." I watched his face as I laid out the evidence. The receipts, the credit card statements, the private investigator's report, the photographs. I watched confusion turn to disbelief. Disbelief turned to denial. And denial turned to devastated acceptance as the weight of proof became impossible to ignore. He kept shaking his head, kept saying, "No, not Stephanie, she wouldn't." But the photographs didn't lie. When he got to the picture of Daniel with his hand on Stephanie's stomach, he made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a growl. And he put his head down on my kitchen table and cried in a way that I don't think men like Marcus, successful, confident, always in control men, ever let anyone see them cry. We sat in my kitchen for 3 hours that day and we talked through everything. We talked about the betrayal, about the lies, about how long this had probably been going on. We talked about our children and how to protect them from the fallout. We talked about finances and assets and the fact that both Daniel and Stephanie earned significant incomes that would be at risk in divorce proceedings. And then Marcus, who was a corporate financial advisor and understood money in ways I didn't, said something that changed the entire trajectory of what we were planning. You know what the interesting thing is? Both of our prenups have infidelity clauses. Stephanie insisted on one when we got married because her parents had a messy divorce. And I remember Daniel telling me you guys had one too because you'd seen too many ugly divorces in your legal career. I'd forgotten about the prenup. Daniel and I had signed it 8 years ago before we got married, and I'd barely thought about it since because I'd never imagined I'd need it. But Marcus was right. We did have an infidelity clause, one that I'd insisted on including over Daniel's objections. The clause stated that if either party was proven to have engaged in an extramarital affair, they forfeited their right to any marital assets beyond what they'd brought into the marriage and were responsible for all legal fees associated with a divorce. At the time, Daniel had thought I was being paranoid and unnecessarily harsh. Now that clause was going to cost him everything. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked up the prenup he and Stephanie had signed. His had similar language, though his was even more punitive. The cheating spouse not only forfeited marital assets but was also required to pay a penalty equal to 30% of their current net worth to the faithful spouse. Marcus's family had money, old money that Stephanie had been very eager to access through marriage, and his father's lawyers had written a prenup that protected the family wealth aggressively. Stephanie had signed it without much negotiation because she'd been so confident in her ability to maintain the marriage, and because she'd never imagined getting caught if she did stray. We looked at each other across my kitchen table, and I could see the exact moment when Marcus shifted from devastated husband to strategic financial advisor. "If we do this right," he said slowly, "if we document everything properly and execute this perfectly, we can use these prenups to ensure they lose everything. Not just emotionally but financially. They want to be together. Fine. They can be together broke. And they can watch us rebuild our lives with the assets they thought they'd be taking with them into their new relationship." I should have been shocked by how quickly he moved from grief to calculated revenge, but I wasn't. I was a litigator. I understood that sometimes the best way to process betrayal was to channel it into strategic action, to turn pain into power and make sure justice was served. We spent the next 2 weeks planning. I compiled every piece of financial documentation related to our marriage. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, property deeds, retirement accounts, Daniel's business valuation. Marcus did the same for his marriage. We both consulted with divorce attorneys separately, making sure we understood our legal positions and the strength of our evidence. We opened new bank accounts and quietly started moving money into them, not hiding assets, but protecting ourselves in case Daniel or Stephanie got wind of what we knew and tried to drain accounts or hide income. We documented every interaction with our spouses, recording conversations when legally permitted, saving text messages and emails, building an unassailable case. And then we planned the confrontation. We didn't want to do it privately, didn't want to give them the opportunity to deny or manipulate or turn us against each other. We wanted witnesses, documentation, and public accountability. So we planned it for our annual New Year's Eve party, the one we hosted every year at my house with about 40 of our closest friends and family members. Daniel and Stephanie would both be there, along with our children, our parents, and everyone who'd been part of our intertwined lives. It was brutal, maybe even cruel, but Marcus and I had agreed. They'd been conducting this affair under everyone's noses for 8 months, lying to our faces at dinner parties and family gatherings and holidays. They'd used our friendship, our trust, our children's innocence as cover for their betrayal. So we were going to expose them in front of everyone who'd witnessed what we thought was our happy, stable, loving group of friends and family. New Year's Eve arrived, and I was surprisingly calm considering what Marcus and I were about to do. I'd spent the day preparing for the party like I always did, setting up food, decorating, making sure everything was perfect. Emma was excited about staying up until midnight for the first time, and she kept asking if she could wear her fancy dress, completely oblivious to the fact that her parents' marriage was about to explode. Daniel was in a good mood, probably because he'd managed to sneak away to see Stephanie that afternoon while I was shopping for party supplies. Stephanie and Marcus arrived fashionably late, and Stephanie hugged me like always, told me I looked beautiful, complimented my dress. The performance was flawless, and if I hadn't known the truth, I never would have suspected a thing. The party progressed normally for the first few hours. People ate and drank and laughed. Our kids played together in the basement, and several times I caught Daniel and Stephanie exchanging glances across the room that they thought were subtle but that I now recognized as the looks of two people deeply enmeshed in an affair. At 11 p.m., Marcus and I exchanged a nod. It was time. I clinked my glass to get everyone's attention, and the room gradually quieted down as people turned to face me, probably expecting a toast or some sentimental New Year's message. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. As we get ready to ring in the new year, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the past year and some significant changes that are going to be happening in the coming months. I saw Daniel's face register confusion, saw him start to move toward me like he was going to ask what I was doing. This past year has been incredibly educational for me. I've learned so much about trust, about betrayal, about who people really are when they think no one is watching. The room was completely silent now, everyone sensing that something was wrong but not yet understanding what. For example, I learned that my husband Daniel has been having an affair with my best friend Stephanie for the past 8 months. I learned that they've been meeting at an apartment Daniel rented specifically for their affair, that they've been lying to Marcus and me about work trips and yoga retreats and late meetings, that they've been planning to leave us and build a life together. The room erupted. Gasps, shocked exclamations, people looking back and forth between Daniel and Stephanie whose faces had gone absolutely white. Marcus stood up from where he'd been sitting and came to stand beside me. "Jennifer and I discovered this about 3 weeks ago," he said. His voice hard and cold in a way I'd never heard from him before. "And we've spent those 3 weeks documenting everything, consulting with lawyers, and preparing for what comes next. So let me be very clear about what's going to happen now." He pulled out a folder and held it up so everyone could see. Both our marriages had prenuptial agreements with infidelity clauses. Daniel and Stephanie are about to discover exactly how expensive their affair is going to be. Daniel finally found his voice. "Jenny, this is insane, you can't just, we should talk about this privately, this isn't." But I cut him off. "Privately? You want to discuss this privately? You've been fucking my best friend in an apartment you pay for with our marital assets. And you want privacy? No, Daniel. You lost the right to privacy when you decided to destroy our marriage and our daughter's family. Everyone in this room is going to know exactly what you did and exactly what it's going to cost you." Marcus opened the folder and began reading from the prenup. "In the event that either party is found to have engaged in an extramarital affair, the offending party shall forfeit all rights to marital assets with the exception of property and accounts held solely in their name prior to the marriage. The offending party shall be responsible for all legal fees, court costs, and financial penalties associated with the dissolution of the marriage. In my case, that penalty is 30% of net marital assets, which amounts to approximately $1.2 million that Stephanie will be paying me as punishment for her infidelity." Stephanie was crying now, mascara running down her face, and she kept shaking her head and saying it wasn't like that, they'd fallen in love, she hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But our friends and family weren't buying it. Her own mother was staring at her with an expression of absolute disgust. Daniel's brother, who'd been his best man at our wedding, looked like he wanted to physically attack him. And our children. Emma had come upstairs from the basement when she heard the commotion, and she was standing on the stairs looking confused and scared, and that image of my daughter's face in that moment is something that will probably haunt me for the rest of my life. I handed Emma to my sister and asked her to take all the kids to her house down the street. I wasn't going to let my daughter witness the complete destruction of what came next. Once the children were gone, I turned back to the party guests, most of whom were frozen in their seats, trapped between wanting to leave and wanting to see how this played out. "I'm filing for divorce first thing Monday morning," I said. "I have extensive documentation of the affair, including photographs, financial records, and text messages recovered by the private investigator I hired. Daniel will be served with papers at his office, and he will find that our joint accounts have been frozen pending the divorce settlement. He will also find that the infidelity clause in our prenup means he's entitled to exactly nothing except the savings account he had when we got married, which contains approximately $8,000. "That's everything I've worked for," Daniel said, and his voice was desperate now, panicked. "The house, the business, the investments. I built all of that, that's my money." I smiled at him, and it wasn't a nice smile. "No, Daniel. That's our money because we built it together during our marriage. But because you decided to fuck my best friend in an apartment you paid for with marital funds, it's now my money. That's what the prenup you signed says, and that's what's going to happen. You wanted Stephanie. Congratulations, you can have her. And you can both start your new life together with basically nothing." Marcus was laying out similar terms to Stephanie, explaining that her high-earning career as a pharmaceutical rep had generated significant income during their marriage, income that was now community property that she'd be forfeiting because of her infidelity. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, and several of her friends had come over to try to comfort her, but Marcus just kept talking in that same cold, methodical voice. You'll have supervised visitation with our son until we can establish that you're capable of putting his needs before your own desires. You'll be paying child support based on your full income. And you'll be paying me the penalty specified in the prenup, which amounts to about 30% of the money you earned during our marriage. I've already consulted with my lawyers, and they assure me this will all hold up in court. The party broke up after that, obviously. People filed out quietly, most of them stopping to hug Marcus and me and whisper words of support and shock. A few people tried to approach Daniel and Stephanie, but both of them were so devastated and defensive that no one could get through. By midnight, the house was empty except for Marcus and me, sitting in my living room surrounded by party decorations and half-empty glasses of champagne, and neither of us said anything for a long time. We'd done what we set out to do. We'd exposed the affair publicly, we'd destroyed their reputations, and we'd ensured that our prenups would protect us financially. But we'd also just detonated our entire lives. And as the adrenaline started to wear off, the reality of what that meant started to sink in. The divorce proceedings took 11 months, and they were exactly as brutal as I'd expected. Daniel fought everything, tried to claim the prenup was invalid, tried to argue that the evidence was insufficient, tried to paint me as vindictive and irrational. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my lawyers were very, very good. The judge ruled in my favor on every single point, enforcing the prenup to the letter, and awarding me primary custody of Emma with Daniel getting supervised visitation until he could demonstrate stable housing and employment. He was ordered to pay child support based on his full income from before the divorce, which was significant, and he was required to maintain a life insurance policy with Emma as the beneficiary. Marcus's divorce went similarly, though his was even more financially devastating for Stephanie because of the penalty clause in their prenup. She had to liquidate her retirement accounts to pay him the $1.2 million she owed, and she lost the house they'd lived in together because it had been purchased primarily with money from Marcus's family trust. She was left with her car, her clothes, and about $50,000 in personal savings, a far cry from the comfortable lifestyle she'd enjoyed during her marriage. Daniel and Stephanie did end up together, at least for a while. They moved into a small apartment in a less desirable part of the city, both of them working hard to rebuild their finances and their reputations. But apparently the relationship that had seemed so passionate and worth destroying 2 marriages for didn't survive the reality of being broke and publicly shamed and cut off from most of their friends and family. They broke up about 8 months after the divorces were finalized, and last I heard, Daniel was living with his brother and Stephanie had moved to another state to start over somewhere people didn't know her story. It's been 3 years now. Emma is doing well, all things considered. She's in therapy to help her process the divorce and the way it happened, and she has a good relationship with Daniel now that he's gotten his life somewhat back together. Marcus and I remained close friends through the entire process, bonded by shared trauma and shared purpose, and about a year after our divorces were finalized, we started dating. I know that probably sounds strange or calculated, like we planned this from the beginning, but it wasn't like that. It was just, we'd been through something horrible together, we'd supported each other through the worst period of our lives, and somewhere in that process we'd fallen in love. Real love, the kind built on honesty and trust and genuine partnership, not the performative love we'd both had in our first marriages. We got married 6 months ago, in a small ceremony with just our families and a few close friends. Emma was my maid of honor, and Marcus's son was his best man, and our kids were genuinely happy to become a family together. We bought a new house in a different neighborhood, somewhere without memories of Daniel and Stephanie and the life we'd all thought we were living together. And yes, we signed a prenup. Neither of us is ever going to be in a position to be blindsided by betrayal again, and having clear legal protections in place actually makes us both feel more secure in the marriage, not less. People ask me sometimes if I regret how Marcus and I handled the discovery of the affair, if I wish we'd done it differently or more privately. And honestly, well, Daniel and Stephanie made a choice to betray us publicly, to conduct their affair in the context of our shared social circle, to use our friendship and our gatherings and our family events as cover for their relationship. They made a choice to plan a future together while lying to our faces every single day. So we made a choice to expose them publicly, to ensure they faced social consequences and financial consequences, and to make absolutely certain that they didn't get to walk away from the destruction they'd caused without paying a price. The prenups were the key to everything. Without those infidelity clauses, Daniel and Stephanie would have walked away with half of everything Marcus and I had built, and they would have used our money and our assets to start their new life together. Instead, they learned that actions have consequences, that betrayal has costs, and that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who'll make sure you pay for what you've done. Marcus and I aren't vindictive people by nature. We didn't do what we did out of cruelty or a desire to see Daniel and Stephanie suffer just for the sake of suffering. We did it because we needed to protect ourselves and our children, because we needed to ensure that the people who'd betrayed us didn't profit from that betrayal, and because we needed everyone in our lives to understand that what they'd done wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness but a calculated, sustained pattern of lies and manipulation that had real consequences. And here's the thing that neither Daniel nor Stephanie understood until it was too late. We weren't just victims of their affair. We were a patent attorney and a financial advisor. Two people whose entire careers were built on being strategic, methodical, and prepared for every contingency. They thought they could outsmart us, outmaneuver us, wait for the right time to tell us about their relationship and expect us to just accept it and move on. They underestimated us completely. And that underestimation cost them everything. I have the divorce decree framed in my home office, right next to my law degree and my partnership announcement. It's not there as a trophy or a symbol of revenge. It's there as a reminder that I'm capable of protecting myself, that I don't have to accept betrayal or abuse or manipulation, that I have the skills and the strength to ensure that people who hurt me face appropriate consequences. It's there to remind me that I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor who fought back, who protected her daughter and her assets and her future, and who came out the other side stronger than before. The prenup saved my life. That document I'd signed 8 years ago, the one Daniel had rolled his eyes at and complained about, the one he'd said was unnecessary and showed I didn't trust him, that document protected me when my trust turned out to be misplaced. It ensured that when my husband decided my best friend was worth more to him than his wedding vows, he paid the full price for that decision. And it gave me the power to rebuild my life on my own terms, with the resources I'd helped create, without having to watch him and Stephanie enjoy the fruits of our labor while Marcus and I struggled to start over. So if there's a moral to this story, it's this. Protect yourself. Get the prenup. Include the infidelity clause. Document everything. And if you discover betrayal, don't let shame or embarrassment or desire to avoid conflict stop you from pursuing justice. Because sometimes the people who claim to love you will hurt you in ways you never imagined possible. And when that happens, you need to be prepared to protect yourself with every tool at your disposal. Daniel and Stephanie wanted to be together. They got their wish. They just didn't get to be together wealthy, respected, and socially connected. They got to be together broke, humiliated, and cut off from most of the people who'd once been their friends. And while I don't take pleasure in their suffering, I do take satisfaction in knowing that they faced real consequences for their choices, that they didn't get away with it, that their betrayal cost them exactly as much as it should have. Marcus and I are happy now. Really, genuinely happy in a way I don't think either of us ever was in our first marriages. We built our relationship on honesty and shared trauma and a commitment to never take each other for granted. We both know what it's like to be betrayed by someone we trusted completely, so we're very careful with each other's trust, very protective of what we've built together. And our kids are adjusted and healthy and glad their parents found happiness again, even if the path to that happiness was messy and painful and involved publicly destroying 2 other people's lives at a New Year's Eve party. The prenup is still in my office. So is the divorce decree. And above both of them is a photograph from my wedding to Marcus. The 2 of us smiling at each other with Emma and Marcus's son standing beside us, a blended family built from the ruins of betrayal but stronger for having survived it. That's the image I look at when I need to remember that sometimes destruction is necessary before you can rebuild something better, and that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival.